Welcome again, everyone, here on this Mother's Day at Lord of Grace. This is another sermon I'll be doing on the series on 6 minor prophets. There are 12 minor prophets, but I'm only talking for 6 weeks. So I had to pick some. So sorry, everyone who wanted the Obadiah sermon. You'll have to just read Obadiah yourself. And I promise you it won't take long. It's like 3 pages. So, but yes, Micah. Micah gives us this great quote, maybe one of the most favoritist quotes, especially of us Lutherans and mainline Christians. I don't know how many church banners I've seen with this verse. It's a wonderful verse, Micah 6:8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? It's a good way to kind of distill down the essence of what it means to be a follower of God and put it in a simple way. And because we can, of course, always make things way too complicated. We're notorious in the church for making Christian life so complicated that we don't know what makes a Christian life a Christian life. But sometimes it is good to just start with basics. And these are the ones the prophet gives. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. And I'd have a hard time arguing with anyone who came to me and they said, you know, what I'm going to do in my walk with faith is I'm just going to really work on those 3. I'm going to devote my life to those 3. I'd have a hard time saying, I'd probably end up saying, yeah, you got it. I don't know if any of us get it perfectly, but you get a lot. But here's the trick, of course. Simple commands can be interpreted a couple ways. You can interpret them in a maximum way and in a minimum way. And that makes a difference in how you approach things. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this a little bit. But when you look at your faith, do you look at what God expects and God's expectations as a ceiling or a floor? The first 5 books of the Bible, they're the Torah, the law. There's lots of stories in them too. But the laws all come in those first 5 books. And there's 613 of them. So there's a lot. The rabbis counted them. And God bless the rabbis because they had to calculate which ones repeat 2 and 3 times, right? They had to look for the duplicates. And they got 613. That's a lot of laws. And following them to a T is almost impossible. There was a guy, I don't remember his name. A few years ago, he did a vlog, a video blog, and he did an experiment with himself of trying to follow all the Old Testament laws perfectly. And he said it got a little tricky because sometimes they contradict each other a little bit. But for the most part, he followed them, and he ended up, wearing only certain clothes and changing his diet around. And so he documents this story. And he's not even a believer. He just wanted to see what it would be like to have that kind of ritual in his life. And they ended up asking him later, like, how did it go? What did you do? Are you a believer now? And he says, well, I didn't change to a believer. But he says, I do have a new appreciation for ritual in life, for structure, for boundaries. So he came away with a positive note. He ends up looking a little bit like a Grizzly Adams at points, with the way he took literally the don't cut your hair verses. But those are the first 5 books. It's a lot of laws. They're hard to follow. But then along comes the prophets. So the law is the first 5, but you get a whole mess after that of histories and then the prophets. And when you get to the prophets, it's kind of interesting because the prophets don't quote many of those laws at all. Of the 613, they maybe quote a handful of them. And the 2 that they really seem to get to over and over, the 2 laws that really concern the prophets are not worshiping idols and remembering the Sabbath day. Those are the 2 prophets 2 laws the prophets keep quoting over and over. The prophets instead what they do is they lean much more into the ethics, the justice. How do we live our lives? How do we treat our neighbors? How do we do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God? But even that could be looked at a couple ways. As I've said many times, we, as humans, I think we're really good at wanting to figure out how to interpret everything so that it involves the least amount of work. And sort of everything is, what is the minimal amount that I have to do? What is the bare minimum? And often faith gets reduced, I think, sometimes, especially when you have a theology that's all about hell, then everything becomes about what is the minimal I have to do to avoid going to hell, as if that was the only thing that mattered in faith. And it was the same problem Jesus had with that young, the rich ruler who comes up to him and says, Jesus, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Well, what he's really asking is, what is the minimal amount of good works for my neighbor that I have to do and still get into heaven? And of course, there's a problem with that question, right? It's like, how much bad, I want to do as much bad as I possibly can, but I don't want to be punished. How much can I get away with? And, and I get it how we are as people. We live busy lives. We have a lot of things going on. Triaging our work becomes kind of a normal thing, right? You got a budget. I only got so much time between all the soccer games to hit the shelter, right? And so what do? We start winnowing things down and trying to get everything down to what do I have to do? What do I have to do? It's kind of like, the kids who always have to ask, is this going to be on the test? What's going to be on the test? When I used to teach over at Pima, I would get that question, what's going to be on the test? And I'd say, I don't know, I haven't written it yet. Well, can you give us an idea? And I said, well, if you studied it in class, it might be on the test. Well, can't you narrow it down? I'm like, no. And then partly, I said, I write new tests every time because I'm not stupid. I know what you guys do. You take your tests and you go home and you post them online. Or you sell them. I might have been born in 73, but that wasn't yesterday, buddy. So, that's the first part, and so I never liked that answer. Even when I was at seminary, I'd get people, is this going to be on the test? I'm like, no, you should want to know. You should want to learn because it will increase your knowledge. You want to be a better, more knowledgeable, experienced person. That didn't ever sell. And I have a theory about this. I'll get on my little soapbox here. Climb up on my virtual soapbox. But I think a lot of this goes back to living in a world full of standardized tests. That this is kind of how we're educated. You got to get past that test. And all these different tests. And I remember sometimes I'll even tell my kids, like, can you believe I made it all the way through high school and never had to take a state-mandated standardized test? And they were like, whoa. Because my kids have like testing week, and I get texts from the school. Make sure your kids are well rested and eat breakfast on test day. Because the school gets judged by these tests. I'm like, the only standardized test I remember taking it was called like the California aptitude or California something. Remember the California test? Mine came back. It said, Lars shows signs of intelligence but could potentially be hyperactive and unfocused or something like that. I think that was 70s lingo for ADD. And now that I'm 52 and you all know me, you know that test was totally wrong. But I think when you have all these tests and they're high stakes, you have to figure out what's on that test because just mastering that's enough work. So then it all becomes about the test, not learning to experiment, not trying to grow, not trying to see how much I could accomplish. Everything's just about that grade. And experimenting too much could be risky. If you stick with what you know and you ace it, that looks better on your resume than I tried a bunch of new things and failed, but I had some good experiences. That never seems to sell with the admissions directors as well. And it makes us always want to know, what is the minimum? What is that floor? Or at maximum, what do I have to know? It tries to make learning efficient. And so I think we develop a mentality like that, and we take it to all parts of our lives, and we take it to God's law as well. Yes, there's 613 of them, and there's a lot of them, but even all those laws, they still give you a limit. There's still a line. Theoretically, there's a spot at which you could go and get to and say, oh, all right, I did all 613. I accomplished it. Now let's go have a beer. A kosher beer, of course, but let's go have a beer. I made it. And in a sense, having those lines, it kind of frees you from having to do the work of sitting yourself and asking the question, have I loved my neighbor enough? Have I made this world as just as I could? Have I been as humble in my own walk? If I've got a line, I don't have to ask the hard work of myself, because then I can get to a point and say, yeah, I'm done. And the prophets are aware of this, and I think that's why the prophets are always leaning into this sort of corrective that says that the ethical life is about more than just following a law, because the people had gotten really good at following the laws, but they were also total jerks to one another. They didn't mix their wool and their linen. That's against the law. Did you know that? I used to think that was silly, but then somebody explained to me, if you put wool and linen in the same thing and run it through the dryer, your shirt's going to look like this. They shrink at different rates. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. They avoided eating screech owls. That's forbidden. That's against the law. There's actually multiple kinds of owls one may not eat. I didn't know this, but I've not been in the habit of trying to eat owls, so I guess I'm within the law. But anyways, if you can follow all those laws, you can still be a jerk. You can obey the law and still be a horrible person. We can all think of lots of mean things we can do to one another that are perfectly legal. But the thing is, when you start getting into the issue of are you loving and doing justice, with those things, there's no limit. There's always more that could be done. There's always someone somewhere who needs something. The need is almost infinite, which is why we probably shy away from it. Because if you're looking for a limit to how much you can do, you're really saying you want to kind of be a jerk. But when the standard is to love all our neighbors and build a just world, that can get overwhelming. But that's what happens when you love. It gets overwhelming. So let's look at Micah's points a little bit. What would a minimum and a maximum look like if you followed Micah? Well, do justice. Do justice. What is a minimum of justice? Well, maybe the minimum is you make some Facebook posts and change the coloration around your picture on your Facebook profile. I don't know how that's going to change a lot of laws and policies, but you can do that. You could occasionally give a little here or there. You could cast a vote to the candidate you think is more just. All good things, but kind of minimum. A maximum view would be that you're going to throw yourself at the unjust system. You're going to stand in front of that tank. You're going to get on that plane and go to that refugee camp in the Middle East. Now, one, of course, is not going to change your life much. The other is going to uproot everything and might get you killed. Love kindness. A minimal view would be to say, I always like to help out my neighbors when they need me. I kind of mind my own business, but, if my neighbor's fence falls over, I'll help put it back up. If his rock wall falls over, I call the mason. I don't have that skill. But if he needs sugar, I'll give him sugar. I'll help chase down his dog when it runs away. I'll be kind, Okay, good things, good things. A maximal view would be to say, I'm going to go out and find people who are lonely and don't have friends, and I'm going to befriend them. I'm going to go to the nursing home, and I'm going to visit all those people who don't get visitors and spend time with them, knowing that even by the time I'm out of the building, they might not even have remembered I was there. Walk humbly with God. What does that look like? The minimum would be to say, well, I don't really push religion on people. I'm not the guy, standing out there on the street corner screaming, God wants women to submit, or whatever thing. I think it was worded much more nasty, but I won't quote that. A maximal view would say, I deliberately go out and serve the community as part of my faith. And I'll share it when people ask. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, but I won't be judgy about it. The maximal view is always harder because it's never done. What Micah says is both making things more simple and making them more hard. It's freeing you from having to get into those nuanced debates about the fine points of whether a platypus is or is not a kosher animal. They're endangered, so don't eat them anyways. But it frees you from having to do that part of self-reflection and the hard work to say, have I been more kind and just? And these are probably, I would say, almost two ways to go through life. A minimum way and a maximum way. One way to go through life, always trying to find what's the least amount I can do, the easiest way to get through. The maximum way is always pushing you. What more is there? Who else needs me? I don't think the second way, while it might be more work, is less fulfilling in life. I can tell you, being someone who sits at this end of it, nobody ever got to a day to the funeral and stood up there at that podium and said, Mike was a good guy, and what we all really appreciated is he did as little for his neighbors as he possibly could. I know he needed to help me change my flat, but all he did was call 911. Nobody ever says that. The things that give meaning to our life, that our communities and our neighbors that we remember, are the things we do above and beyond the minimum that's asked. And I really believe that that's much more the essence of what the life of faith is. That it's a full life, living God's commandments with your whole self, to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Amen.